Hey everyone, this is the introduction to part 1 of Peter Drucker's Max Shachtman and his Left. Part 1, quote, "The working class of this country, will yet be the living vindication of Marxism," end quote. The end of the Cold War is a propitious time to remember Max Shachtman, a radical who predicted the Cold War and did his best to explain and chart it. But there are at least two Shachtmans to remember. One is the Cold War Shachtman, a socialist who became a decreasingly critical supporter of U.S. foreign policy. The other is an earlier pre-Cold War Shachtman, a radical of the 20s, 30s, and 40s. By the time Shachtman died in 1972, the Cold War Shachtman was a figure of some importance behind the scenes of U.S. politics. He was a builder and breaker of coalitions inside the Democratic Party. He was seen as an intellectual gray eminence behind AFL-CIO leaders George Meany and Albert Skanker. He was a mentor for African-American leaders such as Bayard Rustin and socialist intellectuals such as Michael Harrington and Irving Howe. Shachtman even influenced young people who would become prominent in the neoconservative right, influential essayist and editor Irving Kristol and Reagan UN Representative Carl Gershman. This Cold War Shachtman is closest to us chronologically, but he already seems remote from us historically. He made his reputation at a time when the Soviet Union could still be portrayed as the greatest enemy to freedom in the world. The AFL-CIO could still be portrayed as a powerful force that, operating through the Democratic Party, could reshape U.S. society. Today, with the USSR gone and the AFL-CIO rapidly losing what social base and influence it has left, Shachtman's world of the 1950s and 1960s is almost unrecognizable. Paradoxically, in some respects, the pre-Cold War Shachtman of the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s now seems startlingly contemporary. To understand why, we have to reimagine the world of the left in the United States in its heyday. Thanks to the successful destruction of the U.S. left by McCarthyism, that world is remembered today only in patches. But the more clearly we conjure up the picture of that pre-Cold War world, the more unsettlingly familiar it looks. Before the Cold War, as well as in its aftermath, the United States emerged as the world's clearly preeminent power. The U.S. power was threatening in the 1930s, by both economic crisis at home and the growing strength of Germany and Japan overseas. Within U.S. society, the superficial prosperity and speculative boom of the 1920s failed to paper over the glaring disparity between rich and poor. Then as now, many of the world who produced the country's wealth in its factories and sweatshops were immigrants, then mostly from Southern or Eastern Europe rather than from Asia or Latin America, They were often poor, often ununionized, often denied democratic rights that most U.S. citizens would later come to take for granted. These immigrants' languages, cultures, and political traditions were seen as alien and threatening to the cultural elite and much of the, quote, native, end quote, working and middle classes. Sometimes they identified with radical movements, even radical labor movements, and were fighting against dictatorships in their original countries, just as many Haitians, Filipinos, and Salvadorians did in the United States in the 1980s. Many of them viewed the U.S. government, despite its democratic constitution, as a North American counterpart of the repressive governments it supported abroad. Sometimes they worked alongside African American migrants from the South, whose recent arrival in northern cities had fueled racial tensions and clashes. Even in the midst of the 1920s boom, most African Americans and immigrants were denied the affluence they had dreamed of. With the onset of the Great Depression, even native-born white workers felt that the promises of the, quote, American dream, end quote, had been broken. Max Shachtman grew up in this familiar-seeming pre-Cold War world in an immigrant working-class community that was more or less consciously, more or less consistently resisting pressures to adapt, conform, and resign itself to the existing U.S. order. Shachtman's boyhood neighborhood, Jewish Harlem, like many other neighborhoods in the 1920s, had its own embattled working-class values and were opposed to those of the dominant culture represented by Henry Ford and Calvin Coolidge. The politics Shachtman developed in the 1920s and 1930s were rooted in Shachtman's community's oppositional values, though through his education in the Communist Party and the Trotskyist movement and his own creative adaptation of Marxism, he harnessed those values by the 1940s to a vision of a different United States and a coherent original strategy for getting there. When Shachtman talked about the working class in those years, he was neither spouting Marxist jargon nor glorifying union officials. He was talking about his parents and neighbors. In his Harlem neighborhood, his decision at age 17 to join the Communist Party was, if not typical, commonplace. Although communists in their 1920s, immigrant ghettos, were almost as marginal as the socialist left of the 1990s, they were sustained by the subcultures that surrounded them. The people Shachtman knew when he was young were not necessarily communists or socialists, but most of them shared his elemental alienation from and suspicion toward those who control the government and economy. The class identity and class antagonism Shachtman took for granted was not unique to Jews or New Yorkers. It was common to many of the people who lived and worked in industrial centers in the 1920s and 1930s. Most of them were immigrants or children of immigrants who felt their houses, their bosses, senators, judges, and professors belonged to a different and hostile group of people. Working class identity and language united not only the whole left, but much of the working class in the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s. Only later in the 1950s did the dogma take hold that the United States is a classless society. Shachtman's politics grew out of his community's sense of alienation and tried to create an alternative to the alien society it rejected. Out of his particular Jewish immigrant experience, Shachtman developed a personal solution, never uniquely or explicitly articulated, to the conundrum of being a radical internationalist in the United States. In a sense, he overcame the tension between being, quote, American, end quote, and being radical that has bedeviled the U.S. socialist left throughout its existence, a tension that permeates two apparently opposite main currents in U.S. radicalism. One main current among U.S. radicals, rooted ultimately in the radicalism of the war for independence, found particular expression in the agrarian populist side of Debsian socialism. This current has stressed, quote, American exceptionalism, end quote. Its partisans have argued that U.S. socialism should derive primarily from its own native roots in our, quote, new world, end quote. They have often seen Marxism as an alien European import that at the very least needs to be infused with, quote, American, end quote, democratic values before it can be applied to the United States. Sometimes they have singled out the Marxist idea of revolution as particularly alien. Though they believe that the United States must be transformed, they argue that the democratic revolution that took place 2 centuries ago in the United States enabled us to avoid the bloodshed and class hatred that has often characterized, quote, old world, end quote, radicalism. An apparently diametrically opposed current has tended to stress the backwardness of the U.S. left and our need to learn from more advanced European, Asian, or Latin American traditions. The first partisans of this current were German immigrants in the 1870s and 1880s, who introduced Marxism to the United States, but frustrated Marx and Engels by their proud self-isolation from the rest of the U.S. working class. Their attitude was duplicated later by immigrants from Tsarist Russia, who appointed themselves the bearers of U.S. communism after 1917. Some new leftists who wrote off most U.S. workers as irredeemably co-opted and considered Ho Chi Minh, Mao Zedong, and/or Fidel Castro the fonts of revolutionary doctrine and academic Marxists since the 1970s who have specialized in popularizing sophisticated, quote, neo-Marxist and, quote, post-Marxist, end quote, theories from France and Germany. Though superficially these radicals are much more internationalist than U.S. populists, they have nonetheless accepted the populist assumption that Marxism is something alien to the United States. Shachtman diverged from and transcended both these approaches to being a radical in the United States. As a Jew born in Eastern Europe, he identified deeply with the European workers' movement and its theoretical heritage. As a child of parents who chose to come to the United States and believed in its potential for freedom, Shachtman also identified with and was fascinated by all things, quote, American, end quote. For him, Marxism became something that naturally fits in the United States, makes sense of this country, and can enable it to live up to its own best possibilities. Acknowledging that, quote, the working class of this country is the, quote, living refutation, end quote, of Marxism, end quote, he was nonetheless confident that it would, quote, yet be the living vindication of Marxism, end quote. Without ever fully articulating this attitude, Shachtman exemplified it in his political practice. As a young communist organizer reaching out to other working-class teenagers in the years before federal child labor laws, he appealed to a spirit of rebellion, nonconformity, and countercultural experimentation, a striking foreshadow of the 1960s New Left. As a leader in the fight to save anarchist Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti from execution in 1927, Shachtman voiced the suspicion and anger that poor immigrants felt toward police, judges, officials, and the rich, as well as the sense of entitlement to freedom and justice. As a commentator on international events for the Communist Press and then as the exiled Trotsky's, quote, Commissar for Foreign Affairs, end quote, Shachtman expressed the identification that U.S. radicals felt with Augusto Sandino fighting the U.S. Marines in Nicaragua, with the Chinese trade unionists striking against foreign bosses in Shanghai. As a labor journalist, Shachtman helped put out the newspaper that made the difference between victory and defeat in the 1934 Minneapolis General Strike, one of the big strikes that cleared the ground for the CIO. Later in the course of the New Deal and Second World War, most of the U.S. left abandoned Shachtman's 1920-style radicalism. Most communists and socialists tried to throw off their immigrant marginality and become part of the cultural and political mainstream. The CIO began the process by joining native-born and immigrant white and non-white workers into a single, quote, Americanized, end quote, movement. Its New Deal and wartime patriotism prefigured the later patriotic, anti-communist, not-so-militant, even pro-capitalist consensus of the AFL-CIO, the Communist Party, which for a short time in the 1930s and 1940s became the dominant force on the U.S. left, often accepted and even exaggerated this trend, with slogans like, quote, communism is 20th century Americanism, end quote, only to find late in the 1940s that 20th century, quote, Americanism, end quote, was viciously hostile to communism. Shachtman thought that the choices made by most of the U.S. left in the 1930s and 1940s unwittingly helped prepare the division, defeat, and dispersal of the left during the 1950s. He made different choices that were rooted in the intransigent radicalism he had learned in the 1920s. He refused to jump on the bandwagon of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency and oppose the New Deal and the Second World War. His small Workers' Party organized workers during the war to fight against the No Strike Pledge, led wildcat strikes, and nearly won official United Auto Workers' renunciation of the No Strike Pledge over the combined opposition of union leaders in the U.S. government. Through innovative activism in the American Labor Party, Shachtman worked to give the union-based ferment of the mid-1940s independent political expression. Shachtman saw his movement in the United States as part of a worldwide movement that united diverse people in diverse struggles: U.S. strikers, the French resistance to the Nazis, the Irish Republican Army, the Viet Minh fighting both Japan and France in Indochina. Shachtman and his movement predicted the United States' rise to empire and opposed it, while others on the left acquiesced in it. Some of his pre-war and wartime prophecies were impressive in their accuracy. At the same time, Shachtman wrestled with the connection between democracy and socialism, an issue that has concerned and perplexed later radicals. He had a standard for democracy different from any available to latter-day socialists. It was derived from the grassroots democracy of U.S. radicals and their international co-thinkers in the years immediately before and after the Russian Revolution. This standard enabled Shachtman to reject the idea of supporting, quote, democracy, end quote, as the U.S. government practiced and championed it, because he saw how distorted and hollow that democracy could be when used as an adjunct of imperial power. But his vivid sense of what real democracy in action could be saved him from dismissing democratic freedoms as empty. Shachtman fought for several decades against the destruction of democratic freedoms without settling for democratic capitalism as democracy's highest embodiment. He argued that radicals could not only support fights against fascism and McCarthyism, but also lead and transform those fights. Shachtman's commitment to the democratic radicalism of the early 1920s made Shachtman a harsh critic and perceptive analyst of Stalinism. Shachtman seconded Leon Trotsky's criticism of Stalin's policies in the 1930s, campaigning full-time to expose the 1936-38 Moscow purge trials. In 1939 and 1940, Shachtman opposed the Soviet government even more sweepingly than Trotsky could accept, rejecting any support for Soviet military advances into Eastern Europe. Shachtman built his own Workers' Party into the democratic antithesis of bureaucratized communism, priding himself on the freedom and openness of its debates. This is the pre-Cold War Max Shachtman whose story this book tries to tell. The book is written in the hope that it can provide a bridge between Shachtman's pre-Cold War U.S. socialism and the post-Cold War socialism that we can now begin to create. In light of the dangers, homelessness, crumbling cities, ecological disasters now threatening the United States that the New Deal and Second World War gave birth to, Shachtman's intransigent radicalism of the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s deserves a fresh hearing. Not that the answers he came up with can be applied mechanically to today's problems. In many ways, we live in a different world from his. The people around us no longer live in the same neighborhoods, speak the same languages, or have the same hopes as people in Shachtman's time. In other ways, we are aware of dimensions of our world, ecology, sexuality, that Shachtman hardly dealt with in his politics. But the decades that separate us from the 1930s and 1940s have not erased the problems Shachtman faced then. On the contrary, facing the unresolved problems of Shachtman's, quote, American century, end quote, is a prerequisite to meeting the challenges of the 21st century. That's the end of the introduction to part 1 of Peter Drucker's Max Shachtman and His Left. Thanks for listening.